The following teaching is by Jim Pugh through the Ministry of God as Government. If you have never listened to one of our Bridge of Truth podcasts and wish to see all the topics taught through this Bridge of Truth ministry, please go to www.godisgovernment.com to find the inventory of Bridge of Truth podcasts. Now welcome Jim Pugh as he presents another historical study of truth from history, Bible scripture, or current events.
The Occult Economy, the Mother Bank. Carroll Quigley in Tragedy and Hope stated, "It must not be felt that these heads of the world's chief central banks were themselves substantive powers in world finance. They were not. Rather, they were the technicians and agents of the dominant investment bankers of their own countries who had raised them up and were perfectly capable of throwing them down. The substantive financial powers of the world were in the hands of these investment bankers, also called international or merchant bankers, who remained largely behind the scenes in their own unincorporated private banks. These formed a system of international cooperation and national dominance, which was more private, more powerful, and more secret than that of their agents in the central banks. This dominance of investment bankers was based on their control over the flow of credit and investment funds in their own countries and throughout the world. They could dominate the financial and industrial systems of their own countries by their influence over the flow of commercial debts. They could dominate governments by their control over current government loans and the play of the international exchanges. Almost all of this power was exercised by the personal influence and prestige of men who had demonstrated their ability in the past to bring off successful financial coup, to keep their word, to remain cool in a crisis, and to share their winning opportunities with their associates. In this system, the Rothschilds had been preeminent during much of the 19th century, but at the end of that century, they were being replaced by J.P. Morgan, whose control office was in New York, although it was always operated as if it were in London, where it had indeed originated as George Peabody and Company in 1838. On May 17, 1930, the start of the Great Depression, the Bank of International Settlements, BIS, a private financial institution, opened its headquarters in Basel, Switzerland. The major shareholders were the Bank of England, the Bank of France, the National Bank of Belgium, Reichsbank, the J.P. Morgan Company, the Morgan-owned First National Bank of New York, the Morgan-owned First National Bank of Chicago, and the Bank of Japan, which was controlled by the Iwasaki and Dan families, two of Japan's wealthiest clans. These families, which had formed a partnership with Jack Morgan, owned Mitsubishi and Mitsui, two companies that emerged from the 17th century shogunates. Eventually, the Federal Reserve would purchase shares in the Basel Bank and become the leading player in directing its activities. The original purpose of the BIS was to facilitate the recurring problem of the war reparations that had been imposed upon Germany. Although buoyed through the Roaring Twenties by Dawes' Plan, Germany was faced with a new disaster. When Wall Street crashed in 1929, American investors frantically pulled out of their German investments. Foreign capital was no longer flowing into Rhineland. The country was, once again, broke and unable to come up with the mandated annual payment of $623 million to France and Germany. To settle this new crisis, the Young Conference, named in honor of Owen Young, its chairman, was held in Paris in 1929. Young, like Dawes, was closely tied to the houses of Morgan and Rockefeller and served as the president and chairman of the General Electric Company and RCA. A compromise was reached at the Young Conference. The Germans would pay $500 million a year for the next 36 years to England and France, and $375 million for the next 22 years after that to cover the Allies' debt to the United States. The plan was approved at the First Hague Conference. Control of the German economy was returned to Berlin, and a new bank, the Bank of International Settlements, was established to administer the payments. The BIS would serve to commercialize the payments, that is, to issue bonds against them, and would act as a lender to the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, if the German currency weakened and the government found itself unable to make payments. Among its founders of BIS were J.P. Morgan, Owen D. Young, Thomas Lamont, Seymour Parker Gilbert, Jackson Reynolds, and Gates W. McGarrah. Young had served as chairman of both the Radio Corporation of America, which was owned by the House of Rockefeller, and General Electric, which was owned by the House of Morgan. Lamont and Morgan's banking partner, an ambassador to the Paris Peace Conference, EF 1919, and a member of the Jekyll Island Club. Gilbert, another Morgan partner, had served as the Undersecretary of Treasury for the Harding administration. Reynolds was a director of the Federal Reserve of New York and a Morgan economic advisor. McGarrah, who became the first president of BIS, was an official at Chase Manhattan, owned by the House of Rockefeller, and the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Despite the fact that it was established as a result of the Young Conference, the BS, in its statement of purpose, made no mention of the mandated reparations. It rather maintained that its objective was to promote the cooperation of central banks and to provide additional facilities for international operations, and to act as trustees or agents in regard to international financial settlements entrusted to it under agreements with the parties concerned. Throughout its history, the BIS referred to itself not as an institution of settlements, but rather as the central banker's central bank, a place where bankers could meet in secret away from the prying eyes of the press and the nagging demands of the politicians. The constitution of the IIS was written by Sir Walter Layton, editor of The Economist. Layton, in tandem with the Rothschild family, had created a consortium of British businessmen to promote a united Europe. The concept of central bank had been advanced during the 1920s by British economist John Maynard Keynes, who called for the creation of a supranational bank that would take command of all national economies, set the exchange rate of all currencies, and manage the value of gold according to a standard commodity index. Since the wealth of the world was being confined more and more to 8 banking families, the formation of a bank to rule all banks appeared to be inevitable. In 1925, Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England, sent the following note to Benjamin Strong, governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I rather hope that next summer we may be able to inaugurate a private and eclectic central bands club, small at first, large in the future. The headquarters of the BIS was a renovated hotel near the Basel Central Railroad Station, where meetings were held under tight security and complete secrecy. No minutes, agenda, or attendance list was published in any form, and the building became inviolate, meaning that the Swiss authorities possessed no authority over its premises. Correspondence to the bank was received by diplomatic couriers. Such measures were necessary to safeguard the true purpose of the bank, which Carroll Quigley, one of America's leading economists, described as follows. The powers of financial capitalism had a far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert, by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank zero-owned and controlled by the central banks, which were themselves private corporations. As soon as it was established, the BIS abandoned its effort to settle the matter of Germany's delinquent payments for reparations and took up the task of stabilizing the world's economies. To accomplish this task, It was allocated control of gold reserves that were held by its member banks. Gold now flowed out of Japan, Europe, and the United States into Basel. But the lion's share of the precious metal came from China. During the 1930s, Chiang Kai-shek, chairman of the nationalist government, was facing war on two fronts, from Mao Zedong's communist insurgency and Imperial Japan. As his government became increasingly unstable, Chiang began to transfer massive amounts of Chinese gold to the BIS and the Federal Reserve. A story concerning the transfer of 203.43 metric tons to Basel and New Torque was reported by the New York Times of February 19, 1937. In 1938, Chiang transported an additional 125,000 metric tons of gold for safekeeping. Thanks to the power of this combined wealth, the BIS could save a country from economic disaster or drive it into a tailspin, and its transitional actions could take place without political or governmental interference. In the first 6 months of 1931, the BIS advanced $10 million to the Bank of Spain to stabilize the peseta, gave a credit of 100 million Austrian shillings to the Bank of Austria when the Credit Anstalt Bank went belly up, and advanced $5 million to the Hungarian National Bank, which was experiencing a revenue shortfall. The activities of the BIS superseded all political, moral, and religious ideologies. The sole concern was the control of capital by the flow of money. Capital represented the resources required to produce goods: coal, oil, iron ore, factories, machine tools, trucks, and roads. Money was the means of purchasing capital. By manipulating the money supply and determining the value of all currencies, the directors of the BIS could hold absolute control over state and society. Personal principles were superfluous. Thus, it came to pass that a group of international bankers, including members of the Reichsbank, met each month to manage international economies and to plan a one-world order, while war raged around them. And no one objected when Paul Heckler, a German deputy manager at BIS, signed his correspondence, "Hail Hitler."
You have been listening to Bridge of Truth, brought to you by biblical teacher and author Jim Pugh with God is Government. For free access to all of Jim Pugh's Bridge of Truth podcast, please go to www.godisgovernment.com. Distribution of the Bridge of Truth and all other teachings are available for worldwide distribution. Thank you for joining us in this broadcast of Bridge of Truth.